Anybody who's watched me on any platform knows I am not somebody to run around championing the glories of the USSR. But at the same time, it's more complicated than what Americans understand. It was, why is South Africa refusing to join the West in condemning Russia or sanctioning Russia? Because Russia, under the USSR, fought against apartheid. They actually stood up against the apartheid regime, and who was supporting it? We were.
Yeah.
So the idea that the USSR was simply this evil empire, it's really not that simple.
Well,
the ideas underlying the USSR were very noble, and in many respects, I'll be the first to say, they didn't achieve what they set out to achieve, not by a long shot. But in many areas, their animating vision of the world motivated them to side with oppressed peoples that we were complicit in oppressing. And I know people will come and say, well, what about people in the Eastern Bloc and people that felt oppressed by them? Yeah, man. Yeah, I almost married a Polish girl. They used to tell me our mother used to tell me stories about how they used to have to like listen to rock music from the West under a blanket in the basement. Again, I'm not saying that. But the version that we get is very, very simplistic.
So we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Ivan Kachanovsky, who is a Ukrainian and Canadian political scientist at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa.
I think most people have no idea actually what happened during this Maidan Massacre, which was a very crucial event, which led to also of the Yanukovych government and later led to Russian annexation of Crimea, to civil war in Donbass, Russian military interventions in Donbass, and finally Russia escalated this war and the conflict in Ukraine and with Ukraine and the West and invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. So most narrative promoted by absolute majority of the media and politicians and government officials is that this massacre was committed by government snipers or police, backward police unit, specifically against activists of Maidan mass protest movement who actually were peaceful protesters against the Yanukovych government. And this story basically is told by all the major media, not only in the United States, but in all major other countries, with just few exceptions like BBC reporting in 2015 and German television documentary in 2014. So all these stories are basically false because they are contradicted by evidence which I examined, and also just kind of contradicted by the Maidan Massacre trial decision, which was issued in October of last year, but was totally blocked out in terms of actual revelations, which confirms that this massacre was committed not by government snipers or government police units, but actually was committed by snipers who were affiliated with Maidan forces, specifically far-right one. I think this is a crucial massacre because it has effect not only on Ukraine, but also for the entire world, because it led to all these conflicts in Ukraine and now to the major war between Russia and Ukraine, and which is also became a proxy war between West and Russia in Ukraine, and still is ongoing civil war in Donbass. So this is, I think, a very important issue, and I think that media blackout of this massacre, despite 10th anniversary of this crucial event, and despite Maidan Massacre trial decision, which was, again, was quite unexpected for me personally, because I did not expect that they would issue such decision based on partially on evidence. Actually, this was blackout by the media was done specifically and to kind of not to reveal this information, which is publicly available, because all the documents which I examined, all my studies, peer-reviewed publications, and a book which will be published soon by major Western academic press, all this evidence now is supported by Maidan Massacre trial decision, which was issued by Ukrainian judges and jury, and again, with total blackout by the media, just with few major exceptions, with few notable exceptions in the West. I think this is just amazing to see this, because I think this is a very important story, and it will still be very important for a very long time.
And when we talk about the massacre you're speaking of and the involvement of right-wing forces, what is the role of those right-wing forces today in Ukraine?
I think, again, there are two different narratives. One is promoted by the West and the Ukrainian government in the media, and the same with Western politicians in the media, that far-right in Ukraine is not important, they are marginal, they are no neo-Nazis, basically in Ukraine, they are not existent, or they basically transform into regular Ukrainian military forces, they abandon their far-right ideology, neo-Nazi ideology and symbols and so on. I examine the role of far-right in Ukraine, and I can say that they do not have majority political support in Ukraine, but they have very significant power in Ukraine, which is much more larger and much more significant than their numbers would imply, because they rely on violence, they have their own armed formations, like neo-Nazi-led Azov brigades now, which was originally battalion. Now they have separate brigades, which are formally incorporated into Ukrainian armed forces and National Guard, but they are actually led by open neo-Nazis. And there are also far-right formations, other formations like Right Sector and other far-right and neo-Nazi organizations. And they have power to influence government policy. They actually threatened Zelensky not to sign a peace deal and to end this war in Donbass, actually before the Russian invasion. And they now openly, again, can challenge Zelensky and his power and his government and his policy if he would try to make a peaceful resolution of this war. So I think their power is very significant, and I think this is far-right now in Ukraine are most powerful in the world because their reliance on violence, their involvement in the overthrow of Yanukovych government in 2014, and also because of kind of they have their own armed formations, and they have total impunity from persecution. And just yesterday there was a just court decision issued in Ukraine, which basically stated that State Security Service of Ukraine arrested or charged one of actually one of the religious leaders of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for justifying Russian invasion of Ukraine, because he stated on his Facebook page that Azov regiment includes Nazis, basically. And so he now faces 8 years in prison for this and confiscation of his property. So this is like Ukraine, and this is just quite unbelievable, because these fighters from neo-Nazi regiment, they openly display their symbols, Nazi symbols, like they praise Hitler, Adolf Hitler, they use swastikas, they use other Nazi kind of symbols openly, again, without any consequences. And now people who say that even on Facebook that they are Nazis or neo-Nazis are actually facing kind of such a punishment, which is quite unbelievable in any kind of democratic country with a rule of law. So this is
This is Ukraine. This is the part that we're talking about right here, the Donbass, and it's made up of these two different provinces. And just so you get a little bit more, in the west of Ukraine, they're pro-European. They speak Ukrainian, and they look at Russia with suspicion. And then the east over here, they're closer to Russia. They're native Russian. They speak Russian, and they look at Russia through the lens of a shared history.
They call themselves the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and they've been controlled by pro-Russian separatists since 2014 with Russia's backing. Now, these so-called People's Republics make up around 1/3 of the Ukrainian districts of Luhansk and Donetsk, and there's what's called a line of control, with the separatists on one side and the Ukrainian forces on the other. They've been fighting each other off and on across that line for years, even though there's supposed to be a ceasefire.
And there was supposed to be a ceasefire, a military withdrawal, and there was supposed to be elections held in rebel-held areas, but none of that happened. Right? They never stopped shelling, and there wasn't a military withdrawal, and there wasn't elections in rebel-held areas.
I mean, it was the Ukrainian government that broke the agreement, shelling the Donetsk and Luhansk republics.
So, you know, the former prime minister of Italy, they got a secret recording of him in which he is heard saying Ukraine violated the Minsk deal. Zelensky tripled attacks on Donbass and pushed Putin to a special operations. That was supposed to last a week, but it escalated after the West sent money and weapons to Kiev. So what he's saying here is that the Ukraine violated the peace agreement they had to stop shelling the people in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Russian speakers in the Donbass. They had a deal called the Minsk deal. They didn't abide by it. Zelensky not only kept bombing them, but ramped up the shelling 3 times, tripled the attacks. Why? To provoke Putin to invade. Berlusconi's saying that. Berlusconi personally and Forza Italia, is that how you say it? So that's the political party that Berlusconi's a part of. So they generally know they're on damage control, saying that leaked audio were taken out of context and are part of a longer conversation. But the recordings are now national scandal and puts Forza Italy in an uncomfortable position. Why is it a scandal? Because he's right. That's why it's a scandal. If what he was saying was a lie, nobody would give a shit. And so after 8 years of them not following the agreement, finally, Vladimir Putin recognized them as separate countries. And so that's going to could trigger a war between Russia and Ukraine. And a big part of it is he doesn't want NATO, he doesn't want Ukraine to become part of NATO. And that's what they're pushing for. So that's part of it. But here's what Joe Biden said after President Putin recognized the Donbass as being a separate country.
So I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response, far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014.
So this is what Aaron Mate tweeted out. He said, for the U.S. project of turning Ukraine into a vassal state while pretending to care about its sovereignty, you couldn't have picked a worse face than the guy who helped organize the coup in 2014 and then got his son a lucrative gas company board seat in the immediate aftermath. So this is the guy talking about the sovereignty, the sacred sovereignty of Ukraine. And what did he do and the Obama administration? They engineered a coup of the democratically elected government in Ukraine and replaced it. Leaked audio reveals embarrassing U.S. exchange on Ukraine. So this is back in 2014 when the United States was picking who was going to be in power in Ukraine.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. When I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
Here you have them on a leaked call or a hacked call, or whatever you want to call it, deciding who runs the Ukrainian government. So it's so absurd when people say, Putin is attacking an independent and sovereign Ukraine. It is a U.S. neo-colony. Fighting really started around 2015, but 2014 was the pivot point when ultranationalist forces were invested with a lot of power as sort of the military muscle, as militias of this new government in Kiev that came into power through what effectively was a coup masquerading as a color revolution known as the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. And officially it brought into power a completely U.S.-backed government that replaced a leader, Yanukovych, who had been, he's called pro-Russian, but he was basically balancing Ukraine with its oldest and closest trading partner and political partner in Russia. And the U.S. obviously wanted him out. A lot of people wanted him out, thought they would have a less corrupt government. A lot of liberal people participated in Maidan. And what they got was a combination of the most corrupt government in Europe, the 9th most corrupt country in the world right now.
Ukraine?
With the IMF just dumping money in. IMF just dumping money in at Joe Biden's command. I mean, in Biden's first speech in Kiev in February 2015, he said, I told the IMF to give them a loan. And the money went straight out to Swiss bank accounts and everywhere offshore. They put a billionaire in power in Kiev, and hit the street muscle were literal neo-Nazis like the Azov battalion, the most ideologically and militarily motivated battalion incorporated into the National Guard. And they went east and started fighting with those on the map that are labeled as separatists, who are actually Russian speakers who are Ukrainian. And if you actually look at UN statistics on deaths, casualties, the lion's share is on the side of those in the Russian-speaking republics that comprise the region of Donbass. So 81% of deaths between 2018 and 2021 of civilian casualties were in the Donbass region. So the US would never have said, Zelensky was bombing his own people, the way they said that about Gaddafi or Assad. And now they're claiming, that these are just Ukrainians, when for years, the humanity of these people and their national identity was completely erased. I mean,
So-
the hypocrisy is staggering.
According to UN figures from 2018 to 2021, 81.4% of the civilian casualties in the Donbass war came in rebel-held territory. 16.3% were in Ukrainian government-controlled territory.
Now, President Putin made another big move. He's ordered Russian soldiers to go into the separatist areas. He says they're peacekeepers.
Has he ordered soldiers into those areas?
There's discussion of it. The Russian Duma has authorized force if necessary, but those photographs were not of any official Russian forces operating within the Donbass region. There is currently no evidence that Russian forces have entered the Donbass region.
Okay.
Although there are lots of claims and rumors, and but that seems to be inaccurate right now.
This is in Foreign Policy magazine. Crucially, however, Ukraine has mainly not been fighting Russia's armed forces in the Donbass. Yes, Russia has armed, trained, and led the separatist forces, but even by Kyiv's own estimates, the vast majority of rebel forces consist of locals, not soldiers of the regular Russian military. Indeed, the Russian armed forces engaged directly in the fighting only twice, in August, September 2014 and January, February 2015, with limited capabilities, although both episodes ended in crushing Ukrainian defeats.
I actually just interviewed one of those fighters. His name is Russell Bentley. He described to me what the situation was on the ground. There are no Russian forces there. Certainly Russia was supportive of what they were doing, but they pulled together starting with pretty much nothing and have become a pretty formidable fighting force. I mean, he lost 10 friends to shelling and attacks. Many other friends had their legs blown off, their arms blown off. And the Russian-speaking population inside Ukraine has suffered massacres and oppression. For example, the burning of protesters in the city of Odessa in broad daylight by neo-Nazi forces. They ran into a union hall and were burned alive by neo-Nazi forces after setting up a kind of Occupy tent-style protest. And we covered that in our discussion. But this happened in broad daylight, and the U.S. said nothing. 3 TV stations were shut down by the Ukrainian government because they were considered pro-Russian.
That's right.
And their station directors and owners were arrested and put on trial for sedition. There was no court process. They are arresting opposition figures. There have been opposition parties that have been considered pro-Russian. Their leaders are getting arrested. Activists have been arrested. The Ukrainian government has sought to cause a drought in Crimea by erecting dams to prevent them from accessing water on the other side because Russia annexed Crimea. The list goes on and on and on. The official language of Ukraine was Ukrainian and Russian. And the Ukrainian Duma, this parliament that's overrun with ultranationalists, has moved to strip Russian as an official language. The Russian Orthodox Church has come under attack. The church that most people follow in the East who are Russian speaking. So it's an entire panoply of attacks on this population that makes their life completely untenable within the US and NATO neo-colony of Ukraine.
When Germany got back together, reunified, part of the promises was that we wouldn't expand NATO, right? We're not going to do it. We've been expanding NATO nonstop, and now we want to do it to Ukraine, which used to be part of Russia. It's right on Russia's doorstep. And NATO broke the promise. So we've been expanding. So that's the big problem here.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his border.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
It's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It's not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
The reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because of his evil.
It's
about that Putin wants to rebuild Soviet empire of evil, like President Reagan told.
It's about Putin being sick.
It's not how you negotiate peace with a madman, but
Nobody negotiated with Hitler.
People are comparing him to Hitler.
Remember Hitler?
He's a Hitler.
We're back when the Nazis invaded Poland.
this is exactly the same what Hitler was doing to Jews.
This is the same. Putin will not stop.
Putin is reminiscent of Hitler.
This reminds me of Hitler.
He's the new Hitler.
Well, Hitler.
This is about a butcher trying to kill people everywhere in the world, just not Ukraine, Syria, all over the place.
I've noticed, and tell me if you can confirm this, that the West, meaning Zelensky and Joe Biden and NATO, they don't really want to negotiate yet. What is your assessment of that?
Yeah, Zelensky's in a tough position because essentially he's caught between the far right in Ukraine, who has literally threatened to kill him if he makes peace with Russia. He's literally faced threats on his life from the far right militants who have an outsized role in the Ukrainian armed forces. Max Blumenthal and Alex Rubinstein wrote about that at the Gray Zone recently. So Zelensky's in a tough spot, and he's chosen basically to follow the orders of Washington. And so far, I agree with you, those appear to be not seriously negotiating. To the point where, Jim, I don't know if you caught this, but a member of the Ukrainian negotiating team was assassinated by the Ukrainian intelligence. Yes. There was a Ukrainian diplomat who was a part of the team who went to negotiate with the Russians, He was pictured in those talks on the Belarusian border, and the next day he was assassinated. And Ukrainian intelligence said that he had resisted arrest when they went to arrest him for being a traitor, and they had to shoot him. There's no way that happened. He was assassinated.
So according to Patrick Revel, who covers Moscow, he says the Kremlin has announced its demands for ending the war in Ukraine. Ukraine must change its constitution to guarantee that it won't join any blocs, meaning like NATO. So it'll stay an independent country. It must also recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Now, that's a whole other story. And it must recognize the eastern separatist regions as independent, meaning the Donbass, which is what the Ukraine government has never stopped shelling and killing 14,000 people since 2005, because when they overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, those people who were native Russians, first speakers, ethnic Russians who lived in eastern Ukraine, they didn't want to go along with the coup that just overthrew their government, and they didn't want to, and the government that was friendly to Russia, and now we're installing a coup which is now friendly to the European Union. They didn't want to go along with that. So there was supposed to be a deal already in place called the Minsk Agreement, where Ukraine government agreed to stop shelling those people in eastern Ukraine. Well, they didn't.
But it was Ukraine with U.S. backing that refused to implement the accord that it signed on to, and that's why Russia now is saying our demand is you recognize these as independent, because you lost your opportunity. Instead of implementing the agreements you agreed to in Minsk 7 years ago, you've been waging this war, so your time has passed. Now you have to recognize them as independent. So it was Russia that was actually recognizing a deal that, with the exception of Crimea, which it took immediately after the 2014 coup, with the exception of Crimea, it would have kept Ukraine's borders as they were intact. Now that's changed because it was Kiev, with the backing of the U.S. and under pressure from the far right in Ukraine, that was refusing to implement the Minsk Accords, which it signed on to in 2015.
Russia keeps door open after the United States rejects key security demands. That was from January 27th. Ukraine won't settle for dialogue with rebels. That's the Ukraine foreign minister says won't settle for dialogue with rebels. Ukrainian foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba on Monday refused direct negotiations with rebels in the east of the country. Here's another one. U.S. and NATO rule out halts to expansion, reject Russia's demands. Ukrainian foreign minister rejects special status for areas controlled by separatists. Russia and Ukraine agreed to a tentative settlement in April that would have halted the war. So this is out of that article. I'll read it to you. It says, according to multiple former senior U.S. officials we spoke with, in April 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appeared to have tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement. Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23rd when it controlled part of the Donbass region and all of Crimea, and in exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. Of course, Hill doesn't mention UK Prime Minister flew to Kiev instantly. So I remember this.
I remember he flew.
I remember that too. It was like, bam.
I didn't know the details, but I remember Boris was like, oh. He showed up like Chris Farley.
Yes. Remember, it was Ukrainian pro-Western paper that reported Johnson's scuttling of the talks. Now, thanks to Hill, we know those talks actually bore fruit. So they gave him an option in April. They had it almost worked out. And who sabotaged it? NATO and the West and the UK. That's who sabotaged it.
They're not winning also, by the way.
Well, that's why Sergei Lavrov is saying, fuck you. So the guy from Russia is telling him to go pound sand. You guys lost your chance to negotiate. Now we're just going to win. U.S. and NATO allies arm neo-Nazi units in Ukraine as foreign policy elites yearn for Afghan-style insurgency.
It's only like 5% not. I'm going to be my friends. I did this show. It's only like 5% Nazi. Like the Mujahideen is only like 5% Al-Qaeda.
I like how they go from, there's no Nazis in Ukraine. That's a Putin talking point. Yeah. Okay, there's just a few Nazis. Okay, everybody has Nazis, though, somewhere. That's how it went.
The president's Jewish. So explain that,
right.
Jimmy.
Oh, that's it. I skipped that one.
Can you explain how Zelensky's Jewish?
It goes, all right, that's right. That's it. I forgot that one.
Because you know how they could never figure out to not immediately kill the Jewish president so they could get our weapons and...
The Western media is whitewashing the Azov battalion. There has been criticism of your reporting, Lev, saying that you're making too much of the white supremacist influences or the far right, the neo-Nazi influences now in Ukraine in the fighting against Russia, though they may have had their beginnings there. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, here we have two brigades of neo-Nazis, and we're perfectly fine with it. The way I look at it is you can support Ukraine without glorifying, without whitewashing neo-Nazis. And it's insane that we are doing this. I think if I was reporting on neo-Nazis anywhere else, I wouldn't have gotten any criticism. But it's because they're our neo-Nazis and we're celebrating them, then I've gotten criticism. The Azov has had extensive tours of America with these wives. Denis Prokopenko's wife was one of them, as well as an Azov veteran. They've been invited to Congress. They met with members of Congress. And twice, last fall and now last month, they've been to Stanford, which is incredible that you have this university, which ironically, one of Stanford's institutes published what is probably the most exhaustive study of Azov's neo-Nazi links. Okay, so one of Stanford's own institute for combating extremism has tracked Azov and has extensively reported on them. And yet, at the same time, Stanford invited them to campus twice. They're going there, they're projecting their logo on the campus, which is a neo-Nazi logo, a wolf's angle, and Stanford apparently is perfectly fine with welcoming them.
Lev Golinkin, I wanted to ask you, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were numerous articles being published in Europe and the U.S. about how Ukraine had become a meeting point for far-right and neo-Nazi groups from the United States and Russia. There were regular conferences there, and of course we've had thousands of foreigners volunteer to fight against the Russian invading troops. What is your sense of what proportion of these foreign fighters are also neo-Nazis?
It's no different than the networks of Islamists who recruited ISIS when they recruit people from all over the world to come and get experience. Western media across the board suddenly saying, based on nothing, based on propaganda, that this entire group that attracted neo-Nazis from all over the world that we've reported on has suddenly stopped being neo-Nazis, and now they're okay. It's North Korean levels of propaganda, and to see this happen in Western media, it's rather disturbing.
There will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it. There will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Someone blew up Russia's Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, we'd have to conclude without the evidence that it's most likely
Russian sabotage on its own infrastructure.
It's a common sense matter.
I think it's Putin's way of sending a message.
What Putin is saying to us by blowing up his pipeline is, look, I can blow up a pipeline. Everyone knows that Putin did this himself.
It's the closest thing to a smoking gun without the direct proof.
Yeah, I think logic and common sense will tell you that without the evidence, Russia was behind the incident.
We can say it for sure. Who sabotaged the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
The Russians.
I love the certainty and I appreciate the insight.
Yeah, there's exactly one country on that list of suspects, Brad, and Russia would be it.
It's hard to imagine others with a significant motive, but
we will bring it into it.
Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. Who did it? What a mystery.
One way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
But it remains unclear who could have been behind the Nord Stream pipeline leaks.
Make explicitly clear to anyone involved with constructing this pipeline that the consequences of doing so are catastrophic.
Who would do such a thing like this? I mean,
that offers tremendous strategic opportunity.
We still don't know who caused damage to the natural gas pipelines.
The U.S. Secretary of State warned against the pipeline.
The Nord Stream pipeline mystery continues.
U.S. says they'll do everything to stop the Nord Stream pipeline.
We do everything we can.
And I have no idea who is responsible.
Kill Nord Stream 2 now.
Put an end to it.
Use all the tools available.
Stop the Nord Stream 2 and let it rust beneath the waves of the Baltic.
it's almost inconceivable to think that the U.S. would do it.
A member of European Parliament publicly thanked the U.S. for blowing up the pipelines.
This pipeline must be stopped.
Who would do that and why?
According to U.S. government think tank Rand Corp, the first step to weaken Russia is to stop Nord Stream 2.
So it's a real mystery. Halt Nord Stream 2 to stop Russia.
Shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Stopping the Nord Stream.
Take out Nord Stream 2 forever.
Permanently. Ending it permanently.
End it once and for all.
U.S. must take immediate steps to terminate Nord Stream.
Should cancel the Nord Stream pipeline.
Absolutely, we should cut it off.
We must stop this Nord Stream.
We have made clear to the Russians that pipeline is at risk if they move further into Ukraine. We can't find anybody who'd be the obvious culprit in all of this.
When it comes to Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that would bring natural gas from Russia to Germany, it will not happen. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, and now the Russians are pumping out disinformation and lies.
I want to bring in former CIA Director John Brennan.
Russia is certainly the most likely suspect.
Russia is certainly the likeliest suspect of Russia is most likely behind this.
Russia is the likely cause of it.
Likelihood that Russia is behind the attacks.
Very likely.
Likely Russian.
it is likely that this is an act by Russia.
The most likely thing is in fact the most likely thing. Russia.
The most likely suspect at this point, according to many, is Russia.
I've heard people I trust saying that it's just probably Russia.
Vladimir Putin, the most likely.
It's totally something Putin would do, and then go blame it on someone else. Essentially a scenario of cutting off your nose to spite your face here.
Why would Russia bomb its own pipeline? It doesn't seem to make sense if you're thinking in a rational actor scenario, but
Experts agree that Russia is the key suspect.
experts say it's Russia. Experts point the finger at Russia.
Experts pointing the finger at Russia.
European leaders are pointing the finger at Russia.
No fingers pointing at Vladimir Putin.
Pointing the finger at Moscow, the finger at Russia.
Occam's razor points to Russia.
Most logical points to Russia.
German lawmakers point the finger at Russia. Spain points the finger at Russia.
All signs point to Russia.
Signs point to Russia. Russia.
Still kind of seems to me like Occam's razor still point to Russia's involvement.
Russia is a prime suspect.
Putin, the prime suspect.
It's a not so subtle message from the Russians.
Russian sabotage. Russian sabotage.
What's happening here is Russian sabotage.
Sabotage by the Russians.
Sabotage by the Russians.
More stable route, more intimidation from the Russians.
Certainly is.
Well, NATO does not call out Russia by name for being behind the attack.
Looks like it could have had Russia behind it.
Looks like it was a Russian attack.
The attack is right out of Putin's playbook.
Putin's playbook.
Sabotage sounds very part of his playbook.
It's essentially owned by the Russians and a Russian company. It'd be hard to protect against self-sabotage. The assessment is Russia was behind it.
The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, I would bet, was a U.S. action.
What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence. That
Jeff, you gotta stop there. They have to leave it there.
Only Russia could be behind the Nord Stream pipeline leaks. Only one answer, Russia.
It's certainly the suspicions have got to be Russia. Who's doing this? Got to be.
It's the obvious explanation. This was done by Russia.
It's pretty obvious this is a Russian sabotage operation.
Russia says, we had nothing to do with this. Like, come on.
It was probably Russia that blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
I think it did. I'm 99% certain of it.
Everything that I'm reading and sensing is that
Russia did it.
Russian or Russian forces. So,
Russia has done what it frequently does when it is responsible for something, which is make accusations that it was really someone else who did it.
Sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline marks a point of no return.
Poland's prime minister called this the next stage in Russia's war escalation.
Putin trying to incite an attack on Russia.
Putin is trying to coax NATO into this conflict.
Explosions that we saw in the Baltic with Nord Stream 1 and 2, that would be an escalation.
I'm serious. He's looking for an excuse to escalate.
It would be the latest excuse for Putin to escalate his attack.
Pipeline leaks will change the course of this war.
This could be one of the most impactful global events of the year, if not of many years. The response to this sabotage leads us down a very potential dark path, especially when it involves nuclear weapons.
NATO says it will retaliate for any attacks on the critical infrastructure of member countries.
The Nord Stream pipeline, if that is a Russian attack, does that count as an attack on a NATO nation?
Any deliberate attack on critical NATO infrastructure will be met with a firm and united response from NATO.
That could mark a new and serious escalation.
NATO may have to respond to this. So potentially, we are looking at NATO making some kind of point of response, other than a strongly worded statement, to Russia for an attack on what is basically European infrastructure.
There was some optimism that maybe the war in Ukraine would be tamping down. Is there any optimism now?
I'm not optimistic about that.
The gas leak in the Nord Stream pipeline has fundamentally changed the nature of the war in Ukraine.
He seems to be laying the groundwork for the potential use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. So maybe a week ago we would have said there's a 10% chance. I think we're probably closer to 25% chance.
It's certainly an alarming escalation there.
I believe it was the Russians.
Fascinating.
Sweden has closed their probe into the Nord Stream pipeline blast. Sweden has said it closed an investigation into the 2022 explosions that crippled Russia's Nord Stream pipelines. Prosecutors in Stockholm announced on Wednesday they had wrapped up their probe into the apparent attack in September 2022, nearly 7 months after Russia invaded Ukraine. The still unexplained explosions on Nord Streams 1 and 2 came as Europe struggled to wean itself off the huge volumes of Russian gas imports that they delivered to Germany, with the Kremlin, Ukraine, and West all swapping accusations.
What? They struggled like it's heroin, and they're like, we just can't stop doing heroin. And then luckily, the place where we were getting our heroin from exploded.
The Swedish authorities, who have previously said that they suspect an unknown state actor of responsibility, said that they are halting the probe after verifying that the case does not fall under its jurisdiction. The primary purpose, public prosecutor Mats Lundqvist said, had been to, quote, to establish whether Swedish citizens were involved in the act and whether Swedish territory was used to carry out the act.
What?
Neither case applied, he added. Basically, they're saying, well, we didn't do it.
Oh,
so the investigation isn't relevant because we didn't do it.
Well, is anybody in Sweden in the CIA, and also is Sweden in Norway?
Probably not. The undersea explosions ruptured the Nord Stream 1 pipeline on September 27th. It was Russia's main natural gas supply route to Germany until Moscow cut off supplies at the end of August that year. The blast also damaged the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which never entered service because Germany suspended its certification process shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Beyond the geopolitical impact, the leaks triggered an environmental disaster, with local wildlife affected and huge volumes of methane discharged into the Baltic Sea in what analysts believe could be the single largest release of methane due to human activity. More than 16 months after the sabotage, there is no accepted explanation.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
I was busy that day. Nate, I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi.
Did you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected, who is interested and who is capable of doing it. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly. It's true.
Yes, but here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this. And it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
This also confuses me. But today's German leadership is guided by the interests of the collective West rather than its national interests. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their action or inaction.
Of course.
But the idea of rogue Ukrainians doing it wasn't even the first narrative they went with. At first, of course, we remember
Russia.
they tried to convince us that Russia did it.
Yeah, but they blew up their own pipeline.
Yeah. That was the narrative at first.
Yeah, it's their fucking pipe. That
of course. Why would they even have to do that? If they really wanted to blow it up, why not just blow it up in their territory and claim it was a Ukrainian drone?
The Western powers are increasingly engaged in conflict with Russia and China, and what we're essentially seeing is a new Cold War. However, not every country is being affected in the same way, and Europe in particular is suffering economically from this new Cold War. While the United States benefits, it is essentially destroying Germany's economy. Today I'm going to be looking at a series of reports that demonstrate how the heart of the German economy, which is its heavy industry, is being devastated by this geopolitical conflict. And Germany is at the center of Europe's economy. So this is going to have significant reverberations across the continent. And finally, I think the most important factor is the end of huge volumes of cheap Russian natural gas, which has significantly increased the cost of manufacturing production in Germany. It's also significantly increased the costs of living in Germany, and energy prices, electricity bills have skyrocketed in Germany, which have really hurt purchasing power, and that has also depressed local demand, which is another reason fueling the recession, because people are spending more and more money simply on paying their bills, which means that there is significantly decreased aggregate demand in the economy. People are not going out to restaurants as much and buying products and consuming. And then finally, the loss of cheap Russian gas means that the cost of manufacturing has increased a lot, and that means that German exports are much less competitive, and its exports have been declining. Bloomberg noted that the energy crisis in the summer of 2022 was a major catalyst. And they say the energy crisis, as if we can't explain what happened. What happened in 2022? Of course, the war in Ukraine and the Western sanctions on Russia, which have backfired hard and hurt European economies. And this recalls a very revealing comment that was made by the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, back in 2022. He admitted that for decades, the low inflation enjoyed by European economies was largely a product of cheap Russian gas and also access to the massive Chinese market, as China was growing very significantly in the 90s and 2000s and had an insatiable appetite for exports from Germany and other European economies. And now with the growing geopolitical tensions and the new Cold War that the West is waging against both Russia and China, the EU is destroying the very base of its economy. This is that very revealing comment from Josep Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief.
So our prosperity was based on China and Russia, energy and market. You
US takes care of our security. You, China, and Russia provide the basis of our prosperity. This is a world that is no longer there. Our prosperity has been based on cheap energy coming from Russia, Russian gas, cheap and suppose affordable and secure and stable, which has been proved not the case, and the access to the big China market for exports and imports, for technological transfer, for investment, and for having cheap goods. I think that the Chinese workers with their low salaries has done much better and much more to contain inflation than all the central banks together.
But meanwhile, Germany is spending billions of euros building terminals to import liquefied natural gas, LNG. And where is that LNG coming from? The United States. In fact, in 2023, the United States overtook Qatar as the world's largest exporter of LNG. And Europe is spending a lot of money on that LNG. In fact, this even led some of Washington's allies in Europe to criticize the United States for profiting from the war in Ukraine while Europe has been hurting economically. Politico published an article titled "Europe Accuses US of Profiting from War." It notes that top European officials are furious with Joe Biden's administration and now accuse the Americans of making a fortune from the war while EU countries suffer. And Politico quoted an anonymous EU official who said, quote, "The fact is, if you look at it soberly, the country that is most profiting from the war is the US because they are selling more gas and at a higher price, and because they are selling more weapons." Politico also quoted the EU's chief diplomat, Josep Borrell, who called on Washington to respond to European concerns and said, quote, "Americans, our friends, take decisions which have an economic impact on us." And of course, let's not forget the Nord Stream pipelines, the two sets of pipelines that Germany had built with Russia in order to provide cheap pipeline gas to power German industry. And those pipelines were blown up. And the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh reported that the United States blew up those pipelines. And the German member of parliament, Savim Dagdalin, a leftist from a new political party, which I'll talk about later, she accused the US of blowing up the pipeline. She called it a terror attack. And she said that the US is turning the EU into vassal states.
So there was a terror attack in Moscow, and they're now blaming immediately. The United States knew it was ISIS. 2 years later, they don't know who did the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, but they knew the next day that this was ISIS. And so the thing that's interesting, so they the death count's I think close to 200 now. I think I saw yesterday it was 115 were confirmed, but that's way higher now. So these terrorists went to this. On March 7th, there was a security alert: avoid large gatherings over the next 40 hours in Moscow, Russia. Where did that come from? That came from the U.S. Embassy and consulates, and so that came from the State Department. So how did the United States government know about this? Well, let's watch this. So there were gunmen in combat fatigues. They opened fire at a Moscow concert hall and engulfed it in flames. And there's now, I've heard close to 200 deaths, but don't quote me on that. But here we go. Watch this.
You've also seen, hopefully you saw.
So now this is Kirby, White House spokesperson, and he's going to warn people about this terror attack that's coming.
You've also seen, hopefully you saw the State Department or embassy there put out a notice to all Americans in Moscow to avoid any large gathering, concerts, obviously shopping malls, anything like that, just for their own safety. They should stay put where they are and stay plugged into the State Department for any additional updates and information.
So what? Avoid any large gathering, concerts, shopping malls. That's exactly what happened. So then after the attack, they were asked, "Hey, how'd you know about this?" And watch this.
Not aware of any advanced knowledge that we had of this terrible attack.
We didn't have any advanced knowledge of this thing that we predicted exactly that would happen.
On March 8th, the embassy warns of imminent attack in Moscow by extremists. Yeah, I think that I'll let the State Department speak to that. But I don't think that was related to this specific attack. Really,
Putin knows who did it. So this is to me, this is an obvious CIA. The CIA has used ISIS. We propped up ISIS. We basically invented ISIS. The United States government. We funded them. We funded Al Qaeda. The whole thing. And Hillary Clinton admitted that we invented them on video in her testimony to Congress once. So again, we need to have an ISIS. We need to have an Al Qaeda for many different reasons. But certainly was to help overthrow the Syrian government. So that's why we funded the shit out of them. So here's President Putin confirms that the Moscow terror attack was committed by radical Islamists, but that he is more interested in who ordered them to do it. Putin believes a state actor or an intelligence agency could be responsible. You think? So here, holy shit, who is to benefit? The crime can only be a link. This is what Putin said. The crime can only be a link in a chain of attempts by those who are at war with our country since 2014. That's when they overthrew the government, and the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine. That's what happened in 2014. So it sounds to me like Putin's pointing the finger at Ukraine, which of course is acting under the auspices of the United States and the CIA. Putin is referring to Obama's State Department and CIA who overthrew Ukraine. That would be Victoria Nuland. Margaret Simoyan says it was not ISIS, but the West themselves who committed the terrorist attack in Moscow. The individuals behind this operation were purposely selected to be passed off as members of ISIS. This is not new. That the CIA, the Mossad, they do these things, right? Isn't it funny that ISIS hasn't attacked Israel? That's weird that ISIS hasn't attacked Israel over their slaughter of the Gazan people. the Palestinians. Isn't that weird? But they're attacking Moscow. Isn't that weird? Scott Ritter says, if this was something planned by Ukraine, then it means it was something planned by Ukraine under the direction of the CIA to carry out an American policy objective which seeks the strategic defeat of Russia, the former U.S. Marine intelligence officer said in a video comment for Sputnik. So here is Victoria Nuland. Here's what she was promising a couple of weeks before this terror attack happened.
Mr. Putin's going to get some nice surprises on the battlefield. And
he's going to get some nice surprises. And here she was just a little while after that saying the same thing. Watch this.
with this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the east, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield.
That is one evil smile. So there she is twice saying that. Tony Shaffer, he's a New York Times bestselling author, retired Department of Defense intel operative. So here's what he has to say.
I mean, to Victoria Nuland herself, Tory, as they call her at State Department, because she had made direct threats to Vladimir Putin and the Russians. That's all on tape. And she's very direct in her saying that Putin is going to get, quote unquote, surprises. So, let's start with that as a start point. And then you move up to the 7 March warning. And I don't know if you saw it. Diamond John Kirby was there at the White House saying, oh, well, we don't know we didn't have any threat information behind our putting out a warning on 7 March. What? You just randomly put a warning out saying, hey, don't show up at concerts in Moscow. It may be bad. Oh, yeah, we don't know why we put it out. We just put it out.
Look, and I'll say this as a guy who was an expat for many years, that usually when you see warnings like that coming out of the embassy or coming out of the State Department, they are not that specific. This one specifically said concerts, specifically said extremist groups. That's like, you knew something, and that was a slight, that's you and I, since we dealt with declassification, that was somebody had a report, could have been a walk-in, whatever it was, we don't know, and they said, all right, we're going to declassify just enough of this to put it out to the public. Right. That was based on a report, 100%.
And there's a requirement for us to warn people. Absolutely. There's requirements to warn. There are. And I've been in that seat. You have too. So you have to do that. So, now they're saying, oh, we have no specific threat. Okay. When's the last time, Jack, you and I saw this immediate response with all the details? Oh, yeah, 9/11. Within 48 hours, they've listed out all the 9/11 hijackers. Gee, it's really strange how the U.S. government can be so completely naive to things, but have all the details within 48 hours. And you and I both know, as intelligence professionals, you don't gather that information that quickly without already having a head start.
March 7th, the United States Embassy, Moscow, and the UK Embassy, Moscow, issue a warning to a travel advisory to all Americans and British citizens. Stay away, there's going to be a terrorist attack within 48 hours. They put out that the U.S. National Security Council and the White House are becoming increasingly frustrated by, quote, unauthorized brazen actions, end quote, taken by Ukraine against Russia. So this means the United States knew that Ukraine had something in the pipeline. They knew what they had some idea what they're going to do. And the odds are that not only did Ukraine do it, but they did it with weapons and assistance provided by the United States. That's what's got the White House scared to death.
The people inside the State Department are pissed off at Victoria Nuland for doing this, which is why she's out. And they didn't. Go ahead.
The 9/11 example that the guy gave, it's true. Not only did they know who did it, basically as it was happening, because I remember that day, that very day, they said they knew who did it.
Yeah.
But there was also in that example, obviously, the State Department memo that said weeks prior, Bin Laden determined to attack inside the United States using airplanes. Once again, a very specific warning weeks in advance of the actual attack happening. The other thing, that Jackson Hinkle tweet that you showed, where I think he quoted that woman saying that these were meant to look like ISIS recruits. What lends credence to that, in my opinion, is that these guys were paid. They weren't suiciders. They didn't go down with the ship. They were paid and then they tried to flee. That's not characteristic of radical ISIS fighters.
This is from Business Insider. This is from, when is this from? That's from back in 2015. One of ISIS top commanders was a star pupil of the U.S. Special Forces training in the country of Georgia. I showed you how the CIA was funding ISIS or al-Nusra or al-Qaeda in Syria, and the Pentagon was funding another Islamist terrorist group, and they were fighting each other often. We're the ones who are, and what would it be in it for us to prop up Islamic terrorists? Well, because then they could go do our dirty work for us. Wherever we need to have a terror attack, they could go do it for us. Like where? Syria. They could do they could do gas attacks on the Syrian people and then blame it on Assad.
Look, the timing of this is that Russia is on the verge of being able to formally declare victory in Ukraine. We can't get money out the door to Ukraine. The average age of the Ukrainian soldiers now well into the 40s. They're low on weapons. They're low on men. And so this is a way to put Russia back on its heels right at the moment that they're about to lock down this war victory. And, I've said it on our show, over the past, couple of months, as the reality of the Ukraine war is setting in, that the war is all but over, it's all but lost, it's done. The U.S. and the West are not going to react rationally to that realization. They're going to lash out violently.
So the 4 culprits that they arrested in Russia after the attack, where you had well over 100 people killed and almost 200 wounded, have now appeared in court. Okay, so this is after the concert hall attack. They've had their first day of court. The first thing that happened is that you had the media in the United States saying ISIS did this. And the Russians hadn't even uttered the names of these perpetrators, of the people that they had arrested or that they thought were responsible. They hadn't posted or shared their photographs with anyone. So how could the American media, how could they know this was ISIS when the Russians had said absolutely nothing? This is problem number one. They say that because of these photographs that they released, that this proves it was ISIS, okay? They have their whole statement, and they have this one too. And I'll tell you, there's a problem here with what they're doing. Because ISIS usually, they show their faces. They don't hide their faces. I mean, in their mind, they're going off to they're going off to martyr themselves. Okay, so this is something to be proud of. Why would you hide your face? The even bigger problem, the more flagrant issue, is that they're holding their left hands up. Okay, so again, can you see this very clearly? How they have their left hands held up? There's something very, very wrong with this, because you don't do that. Muslims, they simply don't raise the left hand when they're martyring themselves. They just don't. It's the right hand. I'm not a Muslim, but I know what I'm talking about. It's with the right hand, not the left one. And you had some people I saw sharing the image with, basically flipped around to make it look like they have the right hand up, but then of course the Arabic text in the back would look all wrong. This is how they took the photo, because the text is reading the right way, and they have the wrong finger up. And it's not one of them or two of them, it's literally all of them. They're all doing this. So for me, this indicates these people have no idea what they're doing. They are dressing up and pretending to be ISIS. I don't even know if these are the same people that actually carried out the attack. It could be some idiots at the CIA. It could be some idiots at anywhere. I don't know. I'm just telling you, it doesn't fit. And if you're someone who's martyring yourselves, you don't do these kind of mistakes. And he says here that the text they released, this communique, they say muqatilin, that this is atypical. So yes, I mean, muqatilin is fighters, right? There's something particularly wrong with it, but he says it's simply irregular. Usually they will use mujahideen or istashhadeen, those who have been martyred, or the ones who are battling their jihad. So that's correct. You will see those terms much, much more than you will see this word, but that's not all. Then, for example, the statement that they had withdrawn safely. Why would you withdraw if you're going to martyr yourself? The whole point is that you die in battle. This is like a Viking who wants to go to Valhalla, but they just throw their weapon to the side. What do you mean? You're supposed to hold the damn thing. Then, ISIS don't use voice changers in their communiques. Correct? Even Jihadi John, right? He pitched his voice, which I don't even know what the point of that was, because you could tell it's him. But anyway, you don't use it, right? When you're speaking Arabic on top of it. Then, of course, the live broadcast. This is also something irregular and very, very, difficult to pull off, because your reception might be poor. You're inside of a concert hall. You don't even know if it's going to work. They might record themselves, but they're not going to broadcast it. There are other indicators here that tell me that this was not ISIS. I'm not just a journalist. I'm a geopolitical analyst, and I'm telling you that the timing of this is very off. What has happened in recent weeks in the world that could anger someone to attack Russia? Because look, you have to consider this wasn't Tanzania who did this, right? It's not going to be Chile. It's not going to be Syria. Who did this? Who would want to cause this level of terror inside of Russia, in the capital, in Moscow, and have the ability to evade the security services as well? You have to consider, it's not just a question of wanting to hurt the Russians. It's, are you able to circumvent their security apparatus? Who can do that? Okay, so we had Vladimir Putin winning the elections. Overwhelmingly voted in favor of him. I didn't even bother doing a video about it, because what's the point? We know that the people in Russia love him. Maybe you don't like that, or you don't believe that. I don't care. This is a fact. Ukraine are getting, they're getting bulldozed, right? They're getting gobsmacked and smacked down at the same time on the battlefield. And on top of that, the elections also included those territories. So that was sort of another nail in Ukraine's coffin. I'm telling you that it's most likely the United States. And once again, what happened in January, for example? We had a terrorist attack, the worst in history since the revolution in 1979. So Iran's worst terrorist attack in modern history. You had all these people killed, and at the exact same time, the Israelis were assassinating someone in Beirut, and then they were also killing other resistance leaders. So you have a trend here in recent times, in this year, of the Israelis and the Americans launching terrorist attacks and then blaming ISIS or using ISIS as a cover, and then immediately you have telltale signs. ISIS don't speak that way. ISIS don't dress that way. ISIS don't release communiques that way. 4 people by themselves cannot pull something off like this against Russia. This is it's a sophisticated operation, and a very, very critical and deadly one.
Vladimir Putin has instructed his troops to use rape, kidnapping, and murder in front of family members as a weapon of war to demoralize the people of Ukraine. I hope that our colleagues will choose democracy and decency rather than autocracy and evil, because I fear that if you choose the Putin route, you will have blood on your hands. Blood of the children, blood of their mothers, raped in front of their parents, raped in front of their children. I urge an aye vote on this and all the other bills before us today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
U.S. says Russia is compiling a list of Ukrainians, quote, to be killed or sent to camps following a military occupation. The allegation is in letter to the UN sent Sunday and obtained by the Washington Post. My latest. So Aaron Mate had the perfect response. He said, jokes aside, this ranks as one of the most cynical and offensive U.S. intelligence propaganda attempts ever, up there with Gaddafi's mass Viagra pills or Kuwaiti babies being seized from incubators.